Her knees hit the wet tiles, but she barely felt the impact. The world around her sounded distant, muffled, like she was underwater with the car. She stared at the pool, at the faint shadow of the GLK resting at the bottom, and something inside her shifted in a way that was quiet, but permanent. The shock was too deep for tears. No screaming. No drama. Just a heavy, undeniable realization settling into her bones. For years, she had explained Orlando's behavior away. He's just insecure. He's stressed. He doesn't mean it like that. Marriage is not easy. But kneeling there, soaked and shaking, she understood something she could no longer soften or excuse. This was not insecurity. This was not stress. This was not normal marriage problems. This was calculated humiliation. From inside the house, through the open window, Orlando's voice floated out, calm, controlled, almost gentle. I told you not to disrespect me, Christy. You refused to listen. Now you see. That calmness was the most frightening part. Not rage. Not shouting. Just quiet satisfaction. Around the compound, neighbors stood frozen. The woman down the street slowly lowered her wrapper from her mouth. The phone that had been recording dropped slightly. Nobody spoke. Even the birds seemed to have paused. The water in the pool stilled. And under that smooth blue surface lay more than just a car. It was the burial of fear. The burial of silence. The burial of the version of Christy that kept shrinking herself to keep a man comfortable. One question hung in the air. What kind of man destroys something valuable just to feel powerful? But an even more important question began forming beneath it. What kind of woman survives that, and rises? Because here is what Orlando did not understand. He thought the car represented pride. He thought it represented disrespect. He thought it represented a threat to his authority. But what it really represented was independence. And independence, once awakened, does not drown easily. That afternoon, as Christy slowly stood to her feet, something had changed in her eyes. The shock was still there, yes. The pain was real. But beneath it, something steady was forming. Clarity. For the first time in years, she stopped asking, how do I keep this marriage peaceful? And started asking, how do I protect myself and my children? That is a different kind of question. And it leads to different kinds of decisions. Inside the house, Orlando believed he had restored order. He believed he had taught her a lesson. He believed fear would settle back into her bones. But sometimes the very act meant to silence someone becomes the moment that frees them. And here's where the story truly shifts. Because what nobody outside that fence knew, not the neighbors, not the woman holding her wrapper, not even Orlando pacing inside with wounded pride, was that Christy was no longer the same woman who had resigned her job in tears. She had learned knowledge. She had hidden savings. She had a successful brother abroad. She had proof of destruction. She had witnesses. And most importantly, she had reached her limit. Now the real question is not, what kind of man does this? The real question is, what happens when a woman who has endured quietly decides she is done enduring? In the next part, we will see. Will Christy stay silent? Will Orlando realize the consequences of what he has done? Or has he just made the biggest mistake of his life? Because one thing is certain. The car may be at the bottom of the pool. But Christy. She is just beginning to rise. Christy did not argue. She did not scream again. She did not run into the house demanding explanations. Instead, she turned away from the pool slowly, very slowly, and walked inside as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The neighbors watched her go, confusion replacing shock. They expected chaos. They expected a scene. But calmness is far more dangerous than chaos. When she stepped into the living room, Orlando was standing near the window, adjusting his cufflinks like a man who had just finished a small inconvenience. You've embarrassed me enough for today, he said coolly. Let this be the last time. Christy looked at him. really looked at him. And for the first time in years, she did not see her husband. She saw a man who needed control more than he needed love. She saw a man who believed power meant fear. She saw a man who had just handed her something priceless without realizing it. Evidence. "You're right," she said quietly. Orlando paused. He hadn't expected agreement. "This is the last time." He mistook her tone for submission. He nodded once, satisfied, and walked past her toward the stairs. But Christie's mind was already moving. Not emotionally. Strategically. That night, she did not sleep. While Orlando snored in the master bedroom, confident in his dominance, Christie sat at the dining table with her laptop open. She reviewed old messages. Bank transfers. Property documents. Insurance policies. She took photos of the pool from multiple angles. She saved the videos neighbors had already begun circulating in the estate WhatsApp group. She documented everything. Because sometimes, the strongest response is not noise. It is preparation. By morning, the story had spread across the compound. People whispered. Some sympathized. Some judged quietly. But everyone agreed on one thing. It was extreme. And extremes attract consequences. Later that afternoon, Orlando received a call from the car dealership. "Sir, we've seen the video. The GLK was under financing. We need to discuss liability." His confidence flickered. An hour later, his business partner called. "Is everything okay at home? Investors are asking questions." Another crack. Then his mother called. "Orlando, what did you do?" Silence on the other end of the line lasted longer than comfort allowed. Because destruction does not stay private in the age of cameras. Meanwhile, Christie made her own call. Not to shout. Not to threaten. But to inquire. "Good afternoon," she said calmly. "I'd like to understand my legal options regarding property damage within marriage." The lawyer on the other end listened carefully. "Was there intent?" he asked. "Yes," Christie replied steadily. There were witnesses. The shift had begun. Over the next few days, Orlando noticed something strange. Christie stopped reacting. No arguments. No pleading. No cold shoulders. Just quiet politeness. She cooked. She spoke gently. She even smiled occasionally. And that unsettled him more than anger ever could. Because fear he understood. Silence he did not. One evening, he confronted her. "Why are you acting like nothing happened?" Christie folded laundry calmly. "Because something did happen," she replied. "And I've learned from it." He studied her face, trying to decode it. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said softly, "I now understand exactly who I'm dealing with." For the first time, Orlando felt something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Not because she shouted. Not because she threatened. But because she no longer seemed intimidated. And power built on intimidation is fragile. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the house. Official. Stamped. Registered. Orlando opened it casually. His expression changed as he read. It wasn't divorce papers. Not yet. It was a formal notice regarding financial responsibility, destruction of jointly financed property, and potential legal implications. His hands tightened. He looked up to find Christie standing at the doorway. "You involved outsiders?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. "No," she replied calmly. "You did. The moment you made it public." The weight of consequences began pressing in. Business associates started distancing themselves. Family members called, urging damage control. Insurance complications surfaced. And slowly, Orlando realized something uncomfortable. The pool incident had not restored his authority. It had exposed his instability. Meanwhile, Christie began rebuilding quietly. She reconnected with former colleagues. She updated her CV. She explored remote consulting options. She opened a separate savings account. Not dramatic. Not reckless. Intentional. Because this was no longer about winning an argument. It was about reclaiming stability. One night, as Orlando sat alone in the dim living room, scrolling through messages he didn't want to read, the house felt different. Less obedient. Less controlled. Christy walked past him toward the bedroom, composed and unshaken. "Christy," he called. She stopped but didn't turn. "What do you want?" The question was simple. But it carried years of unspoken weight. He opened his mouth to respond. Control. Respect. Submission. But none of those words sounded right anymore. Because now there were consequences attached to them. And in that moment, for the first time, Orlando understood something powerful. Fear can keep someone beside you. But it can never keep them loyal. The real tension now wasn't in the pool. It wasn't in the whispers of neighbors. It wasn't even in the legal notice sitting on the table. It was in the shifting balance inside that house. Christy was no longer reacting. She was deciding. And when a woman who has endured quietly begins to decide strategically, everything changes. Now the question is not whether Orlando regrets his actions. The question is regret enough when trust has already drowned? Days passed, but the air in the house had changed. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone passing by, but inside, every step Christy took, every word she spoke, carried weight. Orlando noticed it immediately, how she no longer flinched at his voice, how she no longer waited for permission to make decisions, even small ones. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, it all flowed smoothly, and yet there was a quiet tension beneath the calm. He could feel it in the way she moved past him without a glance, in the way she answered the phone with certainty, in the way she carried herself as if the house was no longer his kingdom but a place she co-owned in spirit if not yet in law. Orlando's pride began to itch. He couldn't name it at first. He told himself it was just a phase. She'll tire herself out, he muttered one evening as he stared at the dim glow of the pool from the veranda. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. The car in the pool was not just a car. It was a symbol, a message he thought he had sent. But Christy had received it differently. Instead of fear, she had found resolve. Instead of submission, she had found strategy. And Orlando, for all his control, could sense the rising tide of her independence. Meanwhile, Christy began to move quietly but decisively. She didn't announce her plans. She didn't confront him again if she didn't need to. She started researching, making calls, and reconnecting with people she had left behind when Orlando had demanded her resignation years ago. Contacts in her old German company, old clients, friends in the legal sector. Each phone call, each message, added invisible bricks to a foundation he didn't know existed. She also began mentoring her children subtly. Anya and S noticed her change, the way she no longer waited for permission to make decisions, the way she carried herself with quiet authority. "Mommy looks happy today," Anya whispered one afternoon as they painted together. Christy smiled softly, hiding the storm inside, because her happiness now wasn't about joy alone, it was about freedom slowly taking root. And then came the first direct challenge. Orlando, still wrapped in his fragile ego, believed he could control the household through intimidation and money. One morning, he handed Christy a list of house rules, things she must follow, from how much she could spend on groceries to when she could allow the children to play outside. His tone was sharp, final, and commanding. But Christy didn't flinch. She took the paper, read it carefully, and then looked him in the eye. "Orlando," she said calmly, "these rules were never ours to make. They belong to you, not me. I will follow the law, I will follow ethics, but I will not follow fear. Not anymore." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument they had ever had. Orlando opened his mouth, tried to speak, but the words died on his tongue. For the first time, he couldn't bully her into obedience. The power he thought he had, the control he thought was absolute, was evaporating right before his eyes. That afternoon, Christy made her first real move in reclaiming her life. She drafted documents to open a separate bank account, transferred funds into it from her hidden savings, and contacted a lawyer to review the house ownership and property rights. All of this, she did quietly, methodically, leaving no trace for Orlando to detect immediately. And then she called Okenedo. "Brother," she said softly but firmly, "we need to plan a way to make sure this family is protected. Not just for us, but for Aini and us. It's time we take the steps your arrival in America has made possible." Okenedo's voice was full of pride and encouragement. "I knew you would do this, sister. I've seen you endure. I've seen you fight quietly. Now it's time to step forward." By the evening, Orlando noticed the subtle shift again. Christy's calm composure had not changed, but her presence in the house was different. He could feel it in the way she answered questions, the way she made small decisions without asking him, and the way the children now looked to her with quiet admiration rather than fear. And that night, as Orlando lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he realized for the first time that fear had limits, but courage, once awakened, had no end. Christy was no longer just enduring. She was calculating. She was rebuilding. She was preparing. And the storm that would eventually confront Orlando. That storm was coming, and it was not a storm of anger or noise. It was a storm of strategy, intelligence, and unyielding courage. The next morning, Christy woke early, before the sun had fully broken over worry. The house was quiet, still holding the echoes of Orlando's temper from the previous night. Aini and S were asleep, tangled in their blankets, unaware that the world they thought was safe had quietly shifted. Christy poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, staring at the pool. The GLK Mercedes-Benz still lay beneath the water, a silent monument to Orlando's jealousy and cruelty. But Christy no longer saw it as a source of pain. She saw it as proof that she had survived, proof that she could endure, proof that she had already begun taking back her life. Her phone buzzed. It was Okenedo. "Sister," he said with excitement, "I've spoken to some friends of mine about your situation. We can start helping you secure your independence legally and financially. This is the moment we've been waiting for." Christy smiled softly. "Thank you, Oken. I've waited long enough. It's time we make a plan." By the time Orlando emerged from his bedroom, confident as ever, Christy had already made her first moves. She had contacted a lawyer, checked the bank for her hidden accounts, and begun outlining the steps needed to ensure her property and finances were protected. She even drafted letters in her mind, documenting every single act of intimidation, every controlling action, and every unlawful destruction of property. Orlando, pacing the living room, completely unaware, believed the house still belonged to him. But little did he know, the walls had begun closing in, not on him, but on his control. Over the next few days, Orlando tried the usual tactics. He questioned where she had spent time, subtly tried to assert dominance by instructing her on household chores, and even suggested they attend couples counseling for his peace of mind. Christy listened, nodded, smiled, and then did exactly what she had done for years, nothing. Except this time, nothing was no longer submission. Instead, nothing was strategy. She documented every conversation. She kept careful notes of his threats. She made mental records of witnesses, of what neighbors might have seen, and of her own rights. Every casual comment Orlando made was logged, every veiled threat stored away for the moment it could be used, not in anger, not in revenge, but as insurance. One afternoon, Orlando came home with a new smugness. He had heard through his network that Christy had been quietly rebuilding contact with her old colleagues. He assumed it was harmless. "Christy," he said, leaning against the doorway, "I heard you've been speaking to people about work. Don't think I'm unaware." Christy looked up from the counter, calmly chopping vegetables for lunch. She smiled faintly, almost teasingly. "Yes, Orlando. I've been reconnecting. Just networking, nothing serious. You know, old friends, old connections." Orlando's eyes narrowed. "Just networking." "Yes. That's all," she replied evenly, her hands never stopping. networking is safe. But don't worry, I always let you know what's happening in this house. Transparency is important, isn't it? He froze. He wanted to argue. He wanted to demand control. But something about her calm tone, her steady eyes, the way she handled the children's schedule without waiting for his instructions, unsettled him. He walked away, muttering under his breath. That evening, after the children were asleep, Christy sat at her laptop, drafting her next move. She created a schedule of financial independence steps, savings, investments, property documentation, and a plan to separate her legal and personal finances from Orlando's reach. She even began looking at small business options she could run from home. It was meticulous, patient work, and unlike the emotional explosions Orlando thrived on, her actions were silent and effective. The first real breakthrough came when she received an email from one of her old colleagues at the German company. They had been impressed by her prior work and offered her a remote consulting position. The pay was modest compared to her previous salary, but the independence it promised was priceless. Christie's heart swelled quietly with hope. Finally, she could rebuild a life that was hers, a life Orlando could not touch. Meanwhile, Orlando remained blissfully unaware of the magnitude of what was happening. He believed silence meant submission. He believed calm meant obedience. But Christie's calm was deliberate. Her silence was a strategy. And her plan was already in motion. The tension in the house began to thicken. Orlando started noticing subtle changes. She asked questions about her personal finances without waiting for his approval. She made minor household decisions on her own. She laughed and joked with the children without seeking permission. Each small act, seemingly innocent, chipped away at the wall of control he had built around her life. And then came the moment that would truly shift the balance. One morning, Christy received a call from the bank. Her new account, legally and fully in her name, was verified. She smiled softly, knowing this was the first brick in the foundation of her independence. Later that day, she discreetly transferred a portion of her hidden savings into this account, money Orlando had no access to. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of control. That night, she spoke to her children quietly. "Mommy has plans to work a little," she said softly, "so that you and your brother can have a safe, happy home forever. We are going to make it even better than before." Aini and S, too young to understand the depth of the past years, hugged her tightly, sensing the determination and calm in her voice. Orlando, sitting on the veranda, noticed her absence from the living room. He called out, "Christy, where are you?" In the study, she replied evenly, "Working." Working. That word, that simple, innocent word, stabbed at Orlando's pride more than shouting ever could. She wasn't defying him verbally. She was defying him with results. She was quietly reclaiming her autonomy, step by step. And for the first time, Orlando realized fear alone would not control her. Because sometimes, the quietest people are the ones planning the loudest comebacks. That night, as the house slept, Christy sat in the dim glow of the study lamp, reviewing the documents she had collected: pool incident, car destruction, financial control, property rights. Every page, every note, every phone record was a puzzle piece forming a picture of the life she deserved, a life Orlando could no longer dictate. Outside, the night air was still. But inside Christy, a storm of preparation, resolve, and hope was quietly building. And when the time came, it would hit with precision. Because Orlando had assumed he could control her with fear and intimidation. But Christy was done being afraid. And the next time Orlando tried to assert control, he would discover something he had forgotten in his arrogance. A woman who has endured years of control and manipulation does not break. She plans. She prepares. And she rises. The following morning, Christy woke before sunrise, as was now becoming her habit. The house was quiet, save for the soft breathing of Aini and S in the adjoining rooms. She brewed a cup of tea and sat at the dining table with her laptop open, reviewing her notes one last time. Today, she would take the next step, not with confrontation, not with shouting, but with strategy. This was a battle of patience, and she was ready to play the long game. Orlando emerged from the bedroom, yawning, stretching, his expression that familiar mask of control. "Good morning," he said casually, expecting her to look intimidated, to greet him with submission. But Christy only smiled faintly. "Good morning," she replied, her tone even, calm, and unshakable. He raised an eyebrow. Something was different. He could feel it, though he couldn't yet name it. The air around her no longer carried fear. It carried certainty. "I'll be going out today," Christy said lightly. "I have some errands and a meeting with a lawyer." Orlando froze mid-step. "A lawyer?" he asked cautiously. "Yes," she said, still calm. "Just for advice." He scoffed. "Advice? You have me in this house. You don't need advice." Christy looked at him steadily. "I need advice to protect what's mine. For me and the children. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. But I'm making sure our home and our lives are secure." Orlando said nothing. He turned and walked toward the veranda, trying to hide the flicker of unease in his eyes. By mid-morning, Christy was on the move. She met with her lawyer, explained the history of financial control, intimidation, and property destruction, and carefully laid out her plan: separate accounts, legal documentation of the house, a claim for restitution for the car, and clear financial boundaries. Every word she spoke was precise, every request deliberate. The lawyer nodded. "You're building a very strong case, Christy. If it ever comes to a legal challenge, you're prepared." Meanwhile, back at the house, Orlando paced nervously. He had tried to maintain control over her for years, but he now realized there were limits he had underestimated. Each call Christy made, each appointment she kept, chipped away at the illusion that he was the one in control. When she returned home, she found the children playing quietly. She smiled at them, ruffling Annie's hair and placing a gentle hand on Essa's shoulder. Then she went into the living room, where Orlando sat, pretending to read a newspaper but clearly watching her. "Orlando," she said softly, "I have started securing our home and finances. For you, for me, and for the children. Everything will remain in the house, everything will remain safe, but I will no longer depend solely on your approval for my decisions." Orlando's jaw tightened. "And why exactly do you need to do that?" "Because control and love are not the same thing," Christy replied, her voice calm but firm. "I want our children to grow up in a home where fear doesn't rule. I want our home to be a place of safety and respect, not submission." He opened his mouth to respond but found nothing persuasive. Fear was no longer working. Anger only made him look petty. And the truth that he could no longer escape, was that Christy had grown stronger, smarter, and more calculated than he had ever anticipated. Over the next few days, Christy quietly strengthened her position. She opened her separate bank account, transferred a portion of her hidden savings, and made plans for investments in small businesses and property. Every step was deliberate, every action invisible to Orlando, but every move increased her independence. Orlando, meanwhile, grew increasingly restless. The house felt different now. The children noticed it too. Where once they feared their father's temper, they now sensed their mother's quiet authority. And as much as Orlando tried to assert dominance, the ground beneath his ego was shifting. Then came the next turning point. One afternoon, Christy received an unexpected call from her former German company. They had been impressed by her recent consulting work and offered her a remote contract with a significant monthly income. For the first time in years, Christy realized she would not have to rely on Orlando for even the smallest financial need. She smiled quietly, imagining the freedom this would bring. That evening, Orlando noticed something strange. Christy was calm, composed, and in full control of her schedule. She had organized dinner, helped the children with homework, and still managed to finish work emails, all without asking for his input or permission. He tried to interrupt, tried to assert his presence, but she politely, firmly, and calmly continued. Each small victory, unnoticed by him, was a step toward reclaiming her life. That night, lying in bed, Orlando stared at the ceiling. For the first time, he felt a flicker of fear. Not for Christy's safety, not for the house, but for his own image, his control, and the illusion of power he had built. Christy had begun a transformation he could not contain. And the most dangerous part. She had no intention of making noise. She would rebuild quietly, strategically, and with precision. Orlando could destroy a car. He could intimidate and manipulate. But Christy had discovered the real weapon: patience, intelligence, and the power of calculated action. The war in the household had officially begun. And while Orlando believed he was in control, the truth was far more terrifying for him. Christy was no longer a victim. She was a strategist. And strategists win wars quietly, efficiently, and without warning. The morning sun had barely broken over worry when Christy woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. For so long, her days had been dictated by Orlando's fragile ego, his threats, his endless controlling rules. But today was different. Today, she moved with quiet determination. She dressed quickly, choosing a simple, professional outfit. Nothing flashy, just smart, elegant, and purposeful. Her hair was tied neatly, her makeup minimal. She looked in the mirror and for the first time in years, smiled, not a forced smile, not a polite smile, but a smile full of inner strength. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was preparing to take control. Christy started the day by drafting a series of letters to her lawyer. Each letter documented every act of intimidation, every financial restriction, and every attempt to manipulate her independence over the past years. She included the car incident, the pool incident, and the ongoing restrictions on her finances. The more she wrote, the lighter her chest felt. She was no longer invisible in her own life. By mid-morning, she picked up her phone and called Okenido. "Brother," she said calmly, "it's time. I need your support on a bigger scale. Not just for me, but for Aini and S. Orlando cannot continue to hold us back. I'm ready to take steps he won't see coming." Okenido's voice was electric with excitement. "Sister, I've been waiting for this day. We will make sure you are protected legally and financially. And when we do, Orlando will learn a very hard lesson. Control can only go so far against courage and strategy." With that, the plan began in earnest. Christy scheduled appointments with her lawyer to formalize her new bank account and set up joint custody documentation for the children, legally and independently of Orlando's influence. She also arranged meetings with trusted friends from her old German company to begin consulting work, ensuring a steady stream of income that Orlando could never touch. The first small test came that afternoon. Orlando, sensing something shifting, tried his usual intimidation tactic. He walked into the living room, a smug smile on his face, and said, "Christy, I heard you've been making arrangements behind my back. I don't like it. Everything in this house belongs to me, and I expect your full cooperation." Christy looked up from her laptop, calm as ever. "Orlando, nothing I'm doing is secret. I am simply taking steps to ensure the stability of our family, for the children, and for our future. Everything I do is legal, and everything I do is necessary." Orlando froze, trying to muster an argument, but found none that could stick. Fear no longer worked. Anger no longer intimidated. Christy's calm, methodical approach was a wall he couldn't breach. Over the next week, Christy executed her plan silently but effectively. She secured a separate bank account, deposited part of her hidden savings, and began transferring funds to it under the guise of routine household management. She contacted her old colleagues and started consulting projects remotely, bringing in a modest but steady income. Each small step increased her independence without Orlando noticing the full extent. Then came the biggest challenge yet, reclaiming the pool incident car's value. While Orlando had destroyed the GLK in his rage, Christy had kept a detailed record of its value and the fact that it had been a gift from her brother. She filed the necessary paperwork to claim compensation, presenting it not as revenge but as a legal right to secure her family's assets. The day she submitted the paperwork, Orlando noticed something strange. Christy moved through the house with a quiet confidence, giving him polite but firm responses, asserting her authority over the children's schedule, and managing the household efficiently without seeking his approval. The power dynamic had begun to shift, and he could feel it. Late that evening, Christy called her lawyer. "Everything is in place," she said softly. "We proceed tomorrow with the legal filing, and from that moment, Orlando's control is limited. I'm ready. Her children, Annie and S, noticed the change too. For the first time, they saw their mother as more than just a caretaker. They saw a leader, someone who protected them, someone who could stand against injustice. Annie hugged Christy tightly one evening. "Mommy, I'm proud of you," she whispered. And Christy smiled. That smile carried years of suffering, years of quiet endurance, and now, years of strategy coming to life. Orlando, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the scale of what was happening. He continued with his day, confident in his control, unaware that the house he believed he ruled was slipping through his fingers, piece by piece. Every act of intimidation, every attempt to assert dominance, was now met with calm, deliberate resistance. Every corner of the home Christy touched became her territory. And then the legal papers arrived at his office, delivered by a former courier. Orlando stared at them in disbelief. "What is this?" he muttered, flipping through the documents. His face went pale as he read each line. Christy had legally protected her finances, secured joint custody, and documented every act of intimidation he had committed. The weight of the truth hit him like a tidal wave. He could no longer manipulate, threaten, or control her without facing serious consequences. For the first time, Orlando felt real fear. Not fear of Christy physically, but fear of losing the illusion of power he had clung to for years. Christy walked into the room calmly, holding a cup of tea. She placed it on the table and looked at him steadily. "Orlando," she said softly, "this is not about anger. This is about justice. This is about protecting our family and reclaiming the life that has always been ours. You chose to be cruel, controlling, and destructive. But I chose courage, planning, and strategy. And courage always wins." Orlando's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, tried to argue, but the words failed him. For the first time, he realized he was no longer the one holding the power. Christy had risen. And from that moment, Orlando's world would never be the same. The following week, Christy woke earlier than usual, the house still cloaked in the soft gray of dawn. She moved quietly through the rooms, checking on Annie and S, making sure their breakfast was ready, their school bags packed. Everything appeared normal, but underneath the calm surface, a storm of change was brewing. Today was the day she would assert herself fully, not with anger, not with tears, but with law, strategy, and courage. Orlando, meanwhile, had spent the night pacing. The legal papers had shaken him to his core. For the first time, he understood that the illusion of control he had built over Christy for years was crumbling. That fear, the one he thought he instilled in her, was gone. Instead, there was respect, cold, quiet, and strategic, that he had never learned to navigate. He tried to imagine his wife as someone who would comply, but every corner of the house whispered her growing independence. By mid-morning, Christy was already at her first appointment with the lawyer. The plan was simple, precise, and designed to hit Orlando where it hurt most, his illusion of absolute authority. Every step she took, every document she signed, legally ensured her independence, her children's future, and her ability to protect her family from Orlando's control. While Christy worked quietly, Orlando remained at the house, his mind spinning. He tried to occupy himself with routine, driving the children, cooking small meals, but nothing provided the satisfaction he once had. Each glance at the pool, where the GLK Mercedes-Benz still rested at the bottom, each memory of Christy calmly asserting her rights, not at him. The realization that Christy no longer needed him began to fester like a wound he could not heal. By noon, Christy had returned home. The children ran to greet her, their excitement palpable. "Mommy, you're back," Annie shouted, clinging to her mother's arm. S followed, a shy grin on his face. Christy hugged them both tightly. "I'm back, loves. Everything's going to be okay." Orlando entered the room at that moment, trying to appear casual. "Back from your lawyer, I see." His voice was carefully measured. "Yes," Christy replied, calm and steady. "And I have taken the necessary steps to secure our home and finances." Orlando's lips tightened. "Necessary steps? What do you mean?" Christy looked at him directly, her gaze unwavering. I mean that from today onward, no one, including you, will control our family finances, our property, or my personal income. I am legally protecting what belongs to our children and me. This is not a threat, it's simply responsibility. Orlando's face went pale. For the first time, he couldn't find words to manipulate her. Fear had been his tool, but now courage had replaced it. Christie's calm authority was a wall he could not scale. The next move was her boldest yet. Christie contacted a real estate agent and quietly arranged for part of her hidden savings to be invested in a new property. A beautiful 3-bedroom house in a quiet, secure estate, fully in her name, fully independent from Orlando's control. This house would become the symbol of her new life, a life where she was in command. That afternoon, Orlando returned home to find Christie in the living room with the children, working on their homework. She looked up calmly. "Orlando, I've made arrangements for additional living space for our family. This is to ensure security and comfort for Aini and S. Nothing to worry about, you still have your room, but this is part of my responsibilities as their mother." Orlando's stomach tightened. Extra living space. And I wasn't consulted. Christie smiled faintly. "You're welcome to your opinions, but decisions regarding security and welfare of the children are my responsibility. I will always consider you, but I do not need your permission to protect them." The anger in Orlando's eyes was unmistakable. He clenched his fists, pacing. "You're undermining me," he finally shouted. Christie remained calm. "No, Orlando. I am exercising my rights and protecting what is mine by law. I am not undermining you, I am standing up for the children and myself. That is what a responsible parent and wife does." Orlando lunged forward, attempting to assert dominance physically, but Christie stepped back, holding her ground. Her calm demeanor, her firm voice, and the children watching closely made him hesitate. The realization hit him, he had lost his ability to intimidate her. That night, as Orlando lay in bed, restless and fuming, he thought about the GLK, the house, the money Christie had quietly controlled and invested, the legal documents that limited his authority, and the new property she had secured. Every one of these moves represented a blow to his ego and his illusion of power. For the first time in years, he understood something he had never truly felt before: Christie was no longer afraid. And with that fear gone, Orlando realized, far too late, that the woman he had thought submissive and dependent was now unstoppable. Christie's rise to independence had begun quietly, deliberately, and with full precision. The next few weeks would see her consolidating power, expanding her income streams, and legally protecting her family, all while Orlando's pride and control crumbled around him. The war was far from over, but the tides had shifted. Orlando could no longer intimidate, destroy, or manipulate without consequences. And Christie, with her courage, strategy, and intelligence, was preparing for the ultimate reclamation of her life. The battle lines were drawn, the first moves had been made, and the next confrontation would test every limit of Orlando's ego and Christie's resolve.